Hello, welcome to this lecture with me, Professor William Wright, going over chapter 2 of Living with Art by Mark Getlein. Kind of a long chapter, so I'll jump right to it. Gonna share my PowerPoint, get that going. Um, yeah, I'm just going to cover chapter 2. I usually combine chapter 2 and 3 together, but I think today I'm going to separate them. We'll talk a little bit about some of the overlaps and things. But yeah, let me just jump right in. Let me be sure that it's sharing correctly, and it is. Excellent. 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 Okay. So, oh, jumped ahead on me. Chapter 2 is titled What is Art? Okay, so it's a little bit of a silly question because it's so broad and so complicated. But that's the question that is presented to us for chapter 2 here. Um, so yeah, we're going to cover a lot of things. We're going to cover, what the physicality of art. We're going to cover the industry of art. We're going to cover the inspirations of art, the commerciality of art, beauty, all of these things. So we're going to cover that today. But first, let's go ahead and start talking about definition. Now, again, this is a definition that is not always concrete. It's obviously shifting. A lot of people kind of add opinions into the definition of art, which, inevitably makes it hard to nail down. But let's talk about yeah, just based on the text that we're working from, Getlein's Living with Art, and talk about here what I kind of present as the definition of art for this class. Okay, so art is not just created things that end up in a museum, although that is kind of one definition. If it's in a museum, it's obviously art. Or at least a created object that's telling a story. But at the end of the day, there are wide, almost infinite arrays of media, which is just the plural of medium, which is the thing that is used to make art. If you need that definition, medium means the thing used to make art. And there's a broad array. Nowadays, especially in the postmodern world, you can pretty much use anything. Everything is allowed to be a medium of some sort. Yeah, and actually, fun fact: the word I've always kind of taught that the word media, it actually, like, in terms of, it's not really related to like the news, but like videos and things like that that are called multimedia are often called that because they span the gap of audio, visual, and design oriented media. But in any case, yes, you can go on and on with the possibilities of art. So in the early Renaissance, going back to some of the earliest times that we start defining for like historical or academic purposes the terms art, in the Renaissance, painting, sculpture, and architecture were often, leading up to it, they were lumped in with music and dance as something that might not always have function besides entertainment. But prior to this, art was just sort of decorating functional things, and possibly in that function being very broad, spiritual, entertaining, whatever. But in the Renaissance, it starts to become something where really for the first time they decide you don't have to have like a purpose besides just that you like it in art, right? That it does entertain you, and it's not necessarily in a deeply psychological entertaining or a spiritual way. It's just purely because you like it. And the artist enjoys to make it. It doesn't necessarily serve a purpose besides being something new to look at. Okay, so at this time, uh, dance, music, and art for entertainment becomes known as fine art. Eventually, we drop the fine. And a big part of this movement, I kind of said it a second ago, but it is also kind of a big part of starting to think of art as something that doesn't always have a function, is that it is often considered innovative or ingenious, and requires a little bit of creativity and imagination. We defined that in chapter 1 of this book, what ingenuity and creativity really mean. But it wasn't until the Renaissance that we said, the artist doesn't have to be someone who, makes this thing that we use and then happens to decorate it. It can be just something that is decorative and genius and new and imaginative. Okay. So yeah, that slide does it attempts to define art as a concrete thing, but in reality, of course, it's very different, and we're just working off of this particular definition. But there are other ways that we find value in art. We find value expressed in art, and here are some of them. Number one, money. Obviously, we decide that art is valuable sometimes because we want it and are willing to pay for it, right? Or someone wants it and someone is willing to pay for it, and that inherently gives it value. That's very numerical and monetary, or like concrete, but that is one way of providing value. There's also originality. Again, getting back to the idea of if it is ingenious, if it's new, if it's creative, if it's really something you can't imagine many people having come up with, that adds value. If it is something that is inspirational to people or to other artists, it creates an entire movement or an entire new style. That influence, that inspiration is a way of creating value. And then, like many things, the fourth one here, limited number of works. If it is more rare, it is more valuable, right? The less of something there is that people want, the more people want it, right? Because it's harder to get a hold of, right? And that adds value. Rarity, right? And then the last one here on this list is the connection that the artwork allows us to feel with the artist, right? So it's a when it becomes like a highway. I don't know. This one's really big with like musicians, right? We think about the idea that we hear their music and we connect with another person and that artist specifically. Yeah, and that adds value. The ability to create a connection between the creator and the viewer or listener or what have you. That connection is also valuable. It's a little bit bigger, yeah, higher minded value, but yeah, that's a part of it. There are, of course, many other ways to create value, but this is kind of the main, set after, just pure entertainment, right? So we value not only the artists and their lives, but also their names become like a bit of a brand. So yeah, we value the fact that it came from a particular artist. We value the story of that creator, and then because that creator creates something else, we immediately appreciate that something else because the creator, it's not only their art that we enjoy, but it's them themselves. This is classical, like this is a really big deal, or like it. We think of branding as a new thing, but in reality, it's an old idea that like, okay, this person did that before, so now we like it. That's why a lot of artists can make something that might be not necessarily the best, but it gets at least attention. Often it gets even heavy-handed criticism. Sometimes they're criticized too heavily because they're this big brand name. But at the end of the day, the attention that they get is due to the branding, right? So yeah, we recognize most of these artists. We recognize their pieces: Michelangelo's David, Andy Warhol's, Campbell soup cans, Van Gogh's field here, and then Picasso, of course, this sort of geometric breakdown. All these things become recognizable and associated with the person, and then they could go on to do something totally different, and we still recognize that person. But in any case, yeah, or that person as a brand. Okay, so real quick, just to kind of highlight this idea of like things that create value in the person. Number one, right off the bat, as we've said before, or as you probably know, the Mona Lisa was painted by Da Vinci, and as we said before, just that fact, when he's basically a rock star of the Renaissance, that being attributed to him, that he painted it, gives it clout, right? In addition to that, well, and really, actually, that was the only clout that it had at the time that it was made. It was, for the most part, it was just a painting of Madame Lisa, Lisa Girardini del Giocondo. I'm trying to say that right. I don't really know if that's right. But in any case, it was painted between 1503 and 1505, and it at that time it was just a portrait for the family. It was meaningful to them on a personal level, but for the most part, any attention it got was mostly because it was painted by Da Vinci. Then it became even more popular because it was chosen as sort of a random example of portraiture work from the Renaissance, probably specifically picked because it was Da Vinci, all that sort of stuff. But then it was displayed, it was chosen to be displayed in 1797 as part of the Louvre Museum, the opening of the Louvre Museum in Paris, which is the first kind of global or internationally known art museum. It's often known as the first art museum, and it's in Paris. And just the fact, the Louvre is obviously something that a lot of people already know about, and it provided clout for the Mona Lisa. The fact that it was there meant it was more meaningful, right? There was also, it seems like a small thing, but I said the story of something also adds value, or at least garners attention. Originally, the painting was larger, right? It had two columns on either side, and it was cropped down, right? Just that fact, it was cropped down. That adds clout, right? It's a part of the story. It's like anything, if you know the story of it, it becomes deeper and more meaningful. Then, for whatever reason, throughout the 1800s, several writers chose to write about it, probably because they were just trying to cultivate something interesting out of what was really, at the end of the day, a simple portrait. But all of this poetry and this writing about the dangerous beauty compared to the Sphinx or a vampire, fatal attraction, all of this like kind of dark beauty being attributed to the artwork obviously makes it more meaningful. Then, on August 21st, 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen by Vincenzo Perugia. Again, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the painting was retrieved 2 years later in November of 1913. This is actually the moment where people really, really know about the Mona Lisa. The fact that it was stolen is one of the biggest reasons it's popular, and that is what it is. The Mona Lisa now attracts over 5 million visitors every year. And this chronology, at the end of the day, remember, at the beginning, it was just a portrait that was only important because it was done by Michelangelo, right? And then it was, or not Michelangelo, I apologize, Da Vinci. Let me be very clear. Done by Leonardo da Vinci. The fact that he painted it is the only reason that it's popular at first, but then it becomes massive because of all of the story that goes along with it. And side note, at the time that I'm giving this lecture, we also, within the last couple of weeks, have had, there was an attacker who, or I guess an attacker, I shouldn't say that, a man who decided to deface and damage the Mona Lisa as part of some sort of demonstration or experiment. I don't know if it was, I haven't read enough about it to know exactly the motives, but he did try to deface it. Luckily, it was behind protective glass, and they were able to get him away from it really quickly. You can see the video of it. It's interesting, and we'll learn about the motives later, but it's just one more thing that puts the Mona Lisa in the news and gives it clout. So there you go. Over 5 million visitors every year. Now maybe it'll be 7, 10, whatever million. Yep. Okay, so talking about this, questions come up. Now, I want you all to write these questions down. It will likely be part of an online assignment or a discussion piece that we'll have later. But either way, I want you to write these down. You can hit pause and write them down at any point. But yeah, it's just these 3 questions, and they're a little bit rhetorical. I understand that. Normally, this is a big conversation that we have in class, but let's just talk about well, we talk about it at the end of this chapter. But yeah, is there a right and wrong way to appreciate art? Is it objective, meaning there's good and bad art, or is disliking it just another part of art? Right? Can you define it as good or bad concretely, or is it just all the same, right? And can you apply your appreciation to other people, right? If someone doesn't like it, is it possible to make them like it? And what if their perspective is wildly different from yours, like a totally different culture or something? Okay, so yeah, write those down. But I'm going to move on for now. So let's talk for a little bit about, the shifting, post-Renaissance. In the Renaissance, art becomes this thing, again, that we can do for entertainment. We start to have, like, rock star artists, the 4 Ninja Turtles. But at the end of the day, this begins a shift that changes even after the Renaissance in terms of, what the purpose of art is, and specifically who the artwork is for. So let's talk about audience. In antiquity, art was almost always based on specific requests from a client, not on an artist's desire or body of work. So this even goes on through the Renaissance, but it's really something from prior to the Renaissance, where most artists who were making a living as artists prior to and in the Renaissance, it was just their job, right? They didn't necessarily get to sit around and think of the inspirations of the things that they wanted to paint. Sometimes they could, but for the most part, to make a living, they just had to wait until somebody said, "Hey, you do this thing for me, paint my family member, paint this house, redesign the stairs on this house, redesign the ceiling on this house." Right? It becomes kind of artwork done on the request of a client, not necessarily artist's desires or body of work. Okay, so this kind of culture leads to almost like trade school type art, where art is done through mostly apprenticeships. And gaining practice while working for an artist. Okay, so remember that schooling at up to this point, especially during the Renaissance, is mostly done through apprenticeship. So a person going and learning directly from an artist rather than an academy necessarily. Academies start towards the end of the Renaissance, but for the most part, prior to and during it, you went and worked for an artist workshop, right? Artwork was created by that workshop, and often those workshops, even the apprentices were often considered like employees, and the even the finished artists who were no longer apprentices, they were often just employees of an artist workshop. So this kind of goes back into the branding thing that like Michelangelo, right? Michelangelo, the name, was really hiring Michelangelo and his team, right? And Michelangelo had employees, and the Michelangelo name became almost more like a business, right, rather than just necessarily the single artist. He was an artist who had apprentices, he had employees, and through all of this system of having apprentices, having employees, that's how you learn to be an artist. That's how you came up, right? And yeah, and again, this is starting to shift during the Renaissance because of the idea that like it's less art is sometimes less functional, it's more inspired, and so right clients uh, the clients can still commission inspired work, but it becomes more and more common as we get through it. But yeah, just remember those ideas. For the most part, at this time, through the Renaissance and before, it's the artwork was being made for specific requests. That's the important way. And then remember to talk or think about apprenticeships and rather than academics and schooling. Now, that begins to change. As we leave the Renaissance, we go through the Baroque, we get through the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and all those things, and we get to the time, basically the 19th century, the time of the Impressionists, Van Gogh, Monet, Turner. Turner's not really, he's a romanticist, but in any case, yes. As we get to this time, we start being more open to art being about the expression of the artist, about the inspiration of the artist. This is much more, even if someone says, here, paint my staircase, or paint the wall at the end of my hallway, they were saying like, you paint what you want to paint, not this thing for the church or this thing that I request, right? Paint your thing. But really at the end of the day, it was almost even more so that art was something the artist would make and then it would be purchased off of them. It started to happen more so. Schooling becomes more academic, right? It becomes more institute driven and it becomes based on art history. So you start to learn about what art was done before, not just the artists that you're going to go work for, but actually all the artists that we know of that had been before, at least, in a certain perspective. But you learn about art, you learn about how to make it. You go to that school, and that school, again, in some ways gives you clout or gives you value. But at the end of the day, it's that you're going to become a knowledgeable artist and then be inspired by that. Not just learn a certain way of doing it and go from there and be commissioned, but you're going to learn and decide what you want to do. So it becomes, it's just traditional schooling, like more like we understand it. Also, I think it's important to know in terms of the 1800s, it had already been happening, this idea of the artist being more expressive, but it adds another layer, little teaser here, that in the 1800s we had the invention of the camera. And that really changed things, right? Because artists before that, a big part of making a living was being commissioned to paint portraits or paint scenes, and you would go out and paint them, and then the viewer would get to look at them. But that was no longer necessary. Painting a person, we could just replace that idea with taking a picture of a person. Painting a landscape, they could just take a picture of that landscape, right? Everything's changed. And so now the artist is sort of behooved, or it's almost necessary for the artwork to start being more based on that person's perspective or that person's inspiration or expression, right? This is when the public begins to relate to the ideas and the imagery on an emotional level. Pretty art, right? It is that now it's not just a scene of haystacks, right, that they could take a photo of. It's a scene of haystacks that's sad, that's cold, that's warm, it's pretty, it's moving, it's a different way of looking at things, and so it becomes pretty again sort of inspired. And this is also at the time where, due to this, the starving artist is born. A lot of artists kind of lose their job when all of a sudden you don't need portraits, right? So unless you know how to make inspired and more expressive or emotional artwork, you aren't making a living, and sometimes that takes time. So that's what the starving artist is, the idea of this artist that is working through their thing, right, that they may not get to, or maybe they will, but they're finding their voice or whatever, and it takes time, it takes work, and it takes all this emotional toil or work. So it's interesting, you think about Van Gogh. He was a starving artist because while we love him now, nobody liked him at the time that he was alive. He died penniless. That's the classic starving artist story. But it's because of this shift to the idea that the artist is this ingenious, emotional, expressive person. Okay, but as we get through that era, we also start to get to the idea of, and it already kind of had started by the public relating to things. The public had decided that Van Gogh's stuff wasn't worth money. So while he was making art for himself, to a certain extent, it was being defined by the public's relation to it. But that becomes even more so as we move into the 50s, the 1950s, early 1900s, and the 1950s. Almost any object created could be given value if decided by the critics and collectors. That's where we start to see the shift here. It's not just about the artist and their inspiration and expression. It's the idea that now someone's going to tell the rest of us that this artist is expressing things well, or is changing our perspectives well. And then the critics, and then also that person is given clout, not just by critics, but also by the people who buy their work. And then the people who dislike their work, right? The critics that say it's good, critics that say it's bad, that can go either way. Sometimes that means it doesn't succeed. Sometimes it succeeds more. And at the end of the day, the collectors start saying, I'm going to pay this much for that, right? And then I will say, after the first purchase of a piece of art, a lot of the big money games that you see, a lot of people are kind of often disgusted by the dollar signs that are put on a lot of artwork, but a lot of us need to understand that that's actually just a game between collectors. A lot of the artists mostly doesn't see a lot of that money. So it's an interesting shift, right? That critics, collectors, and in general, the public. Now, everyday people in the 1900s begin to become more and more able to buy art from the artist directly. And that's a pretty cool development. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's just this interesting new relationship with the public. So skill and quality was determined solely by the way the public perceived it or was told to perceive it. Art is for anyone, it's by anyone, and it is dictated by the inner needs of the artist to express themselves, right? That's how you should, or that's now what we think of, right? That the artist can't help but be creative, and then whether or not that is successful is decided by the art scene, right, or the public being told how to receive it. Yeah, and so this definitely changes sort of the creative side, the ingenious side, right? A person saying something is good, even though it might not be aesthetically good, but it's a new idea, right? That now is like this great artistic achievement or something like that. So I don't know. Everything changes because of the fact that I don't know, just it almost becomes just about the ingeniousness of it, and then how people relate to that ingeniousness. Yeah. So this also though leads to public artworks that become something we put in buildings, something we put in airports or parks or what have you, right? That the city or a collector or somebody decides this artwork is here, so it's going to be put in public, and then we all get to enjoy it. That's not much different, really, at the end of the day, from the Sistine Chapel, where practitioners would go in and see the artwork by Michelangelo. But it's now. Less request of the artist and more of like, hey, artist, fill this space up, right? And the artist has this inspirational, like big idea that sort of becomes a public thing. So yeah, that's just relating to audience. So we go from clients to it being about the artist to being about the public, and so yeah, that changes everything. And so here's another good example of that, or just a discussion of. Sorry, I need to take a drink. A discussion of value as it is assigned to art, or ingenious being recognized, or the inner needs of the art. Like the artist has to create it, right? Or be ingenious, right? And that sort of adds to clout, right? So looking at this, I think it's always worth noting that a lot of people see Thomas Kinkade, and we all know it's beautiful. We all know it's nice, it's colorful, it's bright. But at the end of the day, um, Thomas Kinkade is often not recognized as terribly ingenious, right? Thomas Kinkade made plenty of money and he did lots of cool stuff, and everybody agreed it was pretty things that we, as a public bought. But he didn't get necessarily the critical clout of guys like here, Piero Manzoni, who had this ingenious idea. Now, whether it's good art or bad art is different. It was just considered ingenious. The collectors and critics decided it was worth throwing money at. And again, money is not necessarily a marker of good art, but it is a marker of value in art. In any case, yeah, so he filled 90 cans, or he made 90 cans, and supposedly filled them in 1961. And basically, well, yeah, let me go ahead and say, yeah, he creates them in 1961. They sell at Sotheby's auction in 91. The first can goes, or it's not the first can, but the first can going for a high dollar price. All of a sudden, the first one goes for $67,000 in 1991. The next big ticket one in 2007 goes for, sorry, I'm accidentally hitting buttons here. The next one, 2007, goes for nearly $200,000. In 2008, another one goes for just over $100,000, 1083. And just so we're talking about, we're seeing these big numbers for this just like random can that says artist shit on it. And what it is really, at the end of the day, the artist made these cans, supposedly filled them with shit, and then priced it at the same price as that same weight of gold, right? So gold sold for $35 an ounce in 1961. So 1 ounce is 28.3 grand. So at that time, a can of artist shit should have cost you about $37, a little over $37. So this idea, yes, that he just does just over an ounce of shit, he's going to sell it to you for the same price as an ounce of gold, right? This is like more about the idea, and it's selling the idea that like the artist's genius, right? Anything that the artist makes is this good, meaningful, valuable stuff. And so even if it's a shit, you're going to pay for it, right? And that's the idea. And you're going to pay gold prices. But he was making a joke that it was only $37, and it spiraled because of the genius of it. It did become even more than that. And in 2015, 1054 was sold at Christie's for the astonishing sum of $266,769.38 US dollars, right? So we're talking over $250,000 for a can of shit that it was just a joke that it was even going to be priced $38, but now it's nearly, it's paying for that genius. Now, you may all be kind of like shaking your heads and all that stuff, and I often do, but you got to understand that this was all a point that the artist was making about like this sort of just being given clout because you're a genius or because somebody says so. So it's a pretty ingenious move, really, at the end of the day. It's pretty interesting. And compare that to Thomas Kinkade that we look at and we all know is beautiful art that it may now be going for these prices, but for the most part, critics, would never have recognized this as the same level of genius as artist shit, for what it's worth. Okay, so today we accept a broad range of creations of art. This kind of leads us into the postmodern world. Today we take it for granted that the artist's task is to pursue his or her own vision of art, that we expect artists to be ingenious and show us what they think, and it can only be them. Their job is to express their ideas, insights, and feelings, right? They're going to tell us, how they are on the inside. They are going to create because they have to create. They don't have the option to not do it, right? They just have to do it, right? And that's why they do it. So other times and places did not necessarily share those ideas, though. This is again just kind of reiterating that we have moved into a time where we expect all this insight, this vision, this inner necessity from artists. But other times and places, artists worked under those very different assumptions around the nature of their work, the purpose it served, and all that, and the audience that it was for. So, yeah, this just kind of closes out the idea that we have shifted what art is, from just a job or just something you do for rich hoity-toity people to something that artists can't help but do, and then rich hoity-toity people want it. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. So moving on from that, real quick, I do want to cover that there are artists who specifically become meaningful or interesting because they don't fit into those categories. They didn't go to the academy. They didn't get critical recognition. They have other jobs or something like that. So outsider artists or artists who are considered non-professional artists or self-taught, often with little or no formal training, and they often live outside of urban centers, so they're suburban or many times they're rural. Yeah, so here we have the idea. James Hampton, who worked as a janitor at for the federal government in Washington, D.C., he was a janitor, and he decided that he was going to start making this giant artwork, no training, no academy. He decided he needed to make this vision that he'd had of the second coming of Christ. No, I don't think it's necessarily about literal. It was just an inspiration that he had to make this thing. And so he does it. And he creates this massive, these like sort of tables and fountains and just beautiful, large visions of the second coming of Christ based on the book of Revelations. He worked on it from 1950 to 64, and it is now on display in the National Museum of American Art. So you'd say it's a sculptor, a designer, but at the end of the day, he was a janitor who just had a specific artistic vision. And for whatever the last few slides that you've been shaking your head about, that openness to creativity and the decision to be, like we're going to recognize a person because we say it's good, like basically James Hampton could never have succeeded in the Renaissance because he would have fallen outside of the academy. But now, for better or worse, critics have made it where, okay, he's outside of it, but this is something we should watch. And so that becomes a thing. There's a few others. It is often also called folk art, naive art, art brut, or primitive art. I don't really like any of those words because they're kind of condescending. They come from an academic place, and I don't like it, but I like outsider art because it's about the fact that they fall outside of the norm, but they still have interest, right? Grandma Moses is another famous version of this. Grandma Moses, who died at the age of 101, she painted over 1,600 paintings, and they're very sort of, I will say, use the word naive. They're childish, they're folky. Folk is not a bad word. Folk just means, of the people. This is very everyday. This is not academic. This is not formally trained. It's just interesting. It's fun. It's Grandma Moses's perspective of these very pastoral, rural scenes of her life, which was very rural and pastoral. She is quoted here saying, "If I didn't start painting, I would have raised chickens." How cool is that? In any case, she had 10 children, 11 grandchildren, and died at the age of 101 after doing all these paintings. Amazing. Another artist, just to sort of cap this section on outsider artists, Kermit Oliver. He is actually a Texas artist, and he is a postal worker from Waco who started painting many, many years ago. His story is tragic. It's beautiful. He grew up, in the South, in Texas, and his family. He's an African American artist that lived through the things that, went on in the civil rights movement, all these things, and has kind of seen firsthand some of that. And his story is amazing. And yet he still has this sort of like very proud, like Texas-based, rural-based, like imagery that he creates and paints. He's got a lot of like Christian-based art as well. He actually has an exhibit that's going around the state of Texas. I got to see it. Pretty amazing. But I like to point him out because I'm not sure what year it happened, but several decades ago now, just while he was, being a postal worker and painting, somebody somehow from the Hermes company in Paris managed to see some of his work and commissioned him to start painting some of their scarves. And I don't know if you know what Hermes is. It's a very high end. They have like 2 stores in the United States. They don't have any American artists besides Kermit Oliver, which is pretty amazing. He now has designed 17 scarves for them throughout the years, and they're very high quality. They're hand dyed, like kind of, they're not hand stitched, but they're all very hand designed, and of course he painted them, and they are beautiful colors, beautiful quality, and very high end products. And it's just amazing that it's all from this postal worker. This stuff this is stuff you see at high end fashion shows, and they have this particular artwork from a guy who drives the postal truck, your mailman. This guy did it. It's amazing. So, and this is something that can only happen in the modern world. Pretty awesome. So, if you need to take a break at any point, feel free. I'm going to keep trucking. We're just going to get through chapter 2 in this. I've already said that, but yes, it's kind of a long one, so I'm going to keep going. But if you need to hit pause, go ahead. We're going to talk about a few more things: the role of the observer, art, and beauty. We're going to talk about the definition of beauty. The role of the observer is to experience and reflect upon a work of art. There's a difference between merely being an observer and being an intelligent, informed observer. Okay. So basically, there are 2 specific things that you can do to enhance your art appreciation, your appreciation of art, right? And so this is going beyond audience and being a literal observer of a piece of art. And you can just keep going and like float around and probably just being yourself, you're going to see some art that you really enjoy. But if you want to really internalize it, you can develop your appreciation for art. Obviously, that's why you're in this class. So the ways to do this, the 2 specific things, this is coming from the text, is to expose yourself to as much art as possible and really look at it, right? Find as much art as you can around you. If you're one of those people that in your description of, the first thing you think of when you think of art, you have a negative memory, that's perfectly okay. But understand that if you find more, you might develop a more positive relationship to art. Maybe not, but if you look at more art and you especially like seek out art that might be meaningful to you, and then branch out from there, learn about things that you don't connect with right away, that you maybe have to develop a connection with. Do all this stuff, but do it by just looking at art. Take it in, right? And then that's the first step. The second step is to then study it, right? It's to take things like take this class, to read books like our textbook, to do things that develop your understanding of the way they're created, the reasons they were created, the time they were created, the person who created them, all those things. Study it, and it adds a layer of appreciation, hopefully, to what you do. I'm not here to make you like art, but you can get a deeper understanding of it through these things. So one of the first things we need to talk about, one of the first things we need to talk about is kind of defining beauty, right? Beauty is the thing that's easy to find in a piece of art, really, at the end of the day. We know when we look at something if we like the way it looks. But there is actually a full study of this idea of beauty, and it can be a more layered and complex idea. This study of beauty is called aesthetics, right? The aesthetic of something. And it's basically like a science. There is at times the assumption that all art that we look at should be beautiful. But at the end of the day, beauty is fluidly defined. Not to be cliche, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Now, again, there are some things that are really easy to see the beauty of. We look at this scene of this beautiful cottage on the beach. Most of us like the beach, and in the waves lapping on the rocks is something that most of us would be moved by. The beautiful sunset, the cozy cottage with obviously a fire going in the fireplace. You can just imagine being there and being very like heart warmed, right? It's easy, and we know looking at this, we could study the beauty of this and understand that it's easy to find, right? But at the end of the day, it's not always that simple. We already looked at the image by Edward Weston, of just a cabbage leaf, and most people wouldn't look at a cabbage leaf and think of it as something beautiful. But if you change the way that you look at it, right, it can become something beautiful. If you focus on the curves, if you focus on the light, if you do something different, it can change it, right? And so one of the ways we sort of set up a situation where you can find beauty in things that aren't necessarily obvious beauty is to enjoy things with disinterested contemplation. That's looking at something without any personal stake in it. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, it's trying not to have a personal take on it, trying not to go into something emotionally loaded. I like to think of it like if you look at a plate of food and you're really, really hungry, that plate of food is going to be beautiful because you want to eat it, right? You're happy to see it. You need it. That is not really understanding beauty as a deeper, more layered thing. If we take away, right, let's talk about like a peach, right? If you look at a peach when you're hungry, you're gonna like it because you're gonna get to eat it. If you like peaches, if you look at a peach and you don't want to eat it, you're full, you don't need it, and you're just looking at it, you might get the chance to think about how nice the fuzzy surface looks in the light. You might get to look at how that blush of red curves around the shape and just looks really nice against the yellow or orange, right? You might get to look at it and just not think about it as a food, but think about it as an object. This is one way to make it easier to define beauty. Is like remove yourself from it, right? Now, you don't always have to do that. Sometimes things are beautiful because you put yourself in the situation. But yeah, again, it helps to layer the meaning. So again, we know there is perfect balanced beauty in the world. Beauty is at times defined as highly skillful or just really definable. It's pretty, right? It's colorful, it's bright, it's there's all these possible things. It's symmetrical, very even. It's colorful. It's simple shapes that we understand, again, like flowers, mountains, trees, things that we connect to because of their straightforwardness. And then if they're painted, and they're painted really, really well, we would define that probably as beautiful because of the pure talent, the skill of doing that, right? That's easy, balanced beauty. But this all kind of leads to the idea that sometimes there is beauty that is not necessarily always the best, right? Or it's not always easy. It's not obviously beautiful. Sometimes what is being depicted makes us think things are beautiful, while the stories are more important and may not be, or vice versa. Sometimes what is expressed is important, but the actual image is not pleasurable, right? So we look at this picture here, which has like a sort of layered version of this, because what's painted in the top half is beautiful. It's bright and colorful, and it's a beach. And again, most of us would connect to the beach as like a positive thing. It has this pier that's nice. But then in the bottom half, it has this sort of distorted, creepy figure that is looking right at us and is clearly in distress. So the story, as well as the visual, is sort of unpleasant. It's well painted, though. It's interesting. It's balanced, and the lines lead us to these other people in the background in a way that the space is very kind of tangible. Although then it's sort of disconcerting. Like, why are those people not connected to this person? Right? Whatever. The image is not really pleasurable, and the story is in ways not pleasurable, but it's also nice in ways too, right? That it's pretty up top and the beach, yeah, all these things. But at the end of the day, most people like this piece, even if it is a little disconcerting at times. Now, just to talk about sort of this piece, we look at this and pretty much everybody right off the bat, it's just pretty. It's skillful in a way. The subtlety of the mast of the ship in the background, the brightness, the intensity, the almost explosive sunset is beautiful. It's very colorful. The choppy waves, they're sort of unsettling, but they're big and they're sort of awe-inspiring. We see the ship sort of uh, you know going through this aggressive situation on the open ocean, and it's unsettling, but it's at the end of the day, it's big, it's beautiful. However, this is an example of the story, again, not being necessarily something that is beautiful, right? It's a beautiful moment. It's moving in its visuals, but it's sublime in that what is happening here. Actually, I'll just go ahead and tell you the story of this. This is about a slave ship moving to the Americas across the ocean in the time prior to Turner. This is apparently from a true story. But J.M.W. Turner, painting in the early 1800s, was writing about a ship that was taking slaves to the Americas, and it was coming up on a storm, and they realized they had overloaded the ship. And to survive the storm, they were going to need to offload cargo. What they figured out by process of elimination is that at the end of the day, the slaves were the least valuable cargo, right? Or the cargo that they could get rid of the easiest and then still survive the storm. So, in the middle of the open ocean, they dumped the slaves over to just drown or be eaten or what have you in the storm. And it's a horrible story. It's moving in a very painful and tragic way, and yet in this painting it's being presented to us in a visually beautiful way, right? And that's really the heart of sublimity, the sublime, that it's this moving and awe-inspiring image telling us a horrible story. So yeah, that's an example of ugly beauty, right? So beauty is more complicated than you think. Okay, but moving on from just beauty, let's talk about defining art as a couple different things. So we have style to talk about. Style refers to a characteristic or group of characteristics that we recognize as constant, recurring, or coherent in a particular artwork. So this often develops, from a specific artist, right? A specific artist drawing the same subject matter repeatedly, right? They draw the same sort of ideas or scenes, right? They use the same material, right? So they use the same paints, the same colors, the same cement or plaster, same stone, whatever. There's a consistency of material. There's a distinctive way of doing it. So you think about like Picasso and the way that he looks at a person, breaks it down into specific shapes, and then redisplays it for us, right? This distinctive way of working, or there are artists who paint with certain objects or paint without any objects, right? They just put the paint on the artwork. These distinctive things make it a style. I already talked about it for a second, but color preferences or color combinations also inevitably create a style. All black and white, all blue, all primary colors, right? All those things, they create a style. But then there's also, of course, historical style, cultural style, or a school of style, like a movement, like Impressionism. All those artists were working in different ways, but they had a consistency of style. Neoclassical was always looking back at some other style that they were building off of, and then the historical style is just like, this is the art that was being made at that time. It shares something in common. Cultural style, of course, is this is the group of people or the place that something is being made, right? So working back from that, so those are different ways of thinking about style. Okay, now style folds into, yeah, just looking at these images, we can see, here we have the style of like American Romanticism that's big and bright and very clear. Although I wouldn't call it realistic necessarily in this top left image. It's just very it's skillful. That's what I would say, right? But then compare that to the one on the right, which might be considered sort of simple, but it's really about that. It's colorful. It's a weird use of space, right? It's like looking from the top of a field, but then across the field too. It's like stylized for sure. The bottom left here, this one's by Anselm Kiefer, right? This very textural, almost like somber, nearly black and white kind of sepia tone thing. That's a very distinctive style. And then of course the bottom right, I'm not sure who the artist is actually right off the top of my head, but it's very, it's like totally abstracted to the point of barely being recognizable as a scene of the outdoors, right? We look here again, same sort of idea. There's old school realistic in the top left, then there's the geometric breakdown in the top right, which is, it's very flat and sort of truncates the space. The bottom left one is so hyper. This is new realism that's just so real that it's ridiculous. It looks like a photo. That's a whole style, photorealism. And then of course the bottom right is another geometric breakdown, but it has more space. It has a little bit more impression or interest to it, right, than the top right. Obviously, we can look at all these different styles of depictions of the female figure. Some seem more powerful, some more disturbing, some more moving, some cliche, or the one on the left is sort of almost, it's like overwrought, it's overdone. But yeah, these are all very different styles. Okay, so talking about style and art, that's what I was going to say. This leads into talking about the different ways of displaying something. Okay, so art and appearance, let's talk about threes. This is one of those things, this conversation, the next 3 slides is would be taken from the top 5 things Mr. Wright wants you to know after taking this class, okay? It's a fun party trick to be able to talk about this, especially the second 2. So in any case, art and appearance. Let's talk about representational art, which basically means art that takes something from the world that we are supposed to recognize and then often tries to make it look as close to realistic as possible. We have to be careful using the word realism because, as you'll see later in the class, it becomes interchangeable with like a movement that's about creating images of real people. So we have another word, which is naturalistic, and that's the word you're supposed to use when something looks really real. Right. Realistic is about the fact that it's not just Jesus and the saints or, the Buddha or, royals and stuff like that. It's actually real people. Naturalism means it's from real life. Now, fun fact, I'm not going to give it to you just yet, but this painter here that you see on the right, it's going to really surprise you when you find out who it is, and I will tell you shortly. But at the end of the day, we can see that it is a faithful representation. It's not super duper naturalistic, but it's pretty close. It looks pretty real, and it's showing us what it would look like to be there. That means it's representational. So the second version of this, there's 3, is abstract. Okay, now what I want you to know, this is the big thing to take away from these slides. This is not splatters and dots. Splatters and dots are their own thing. We'll talk about in a second. Abstract art actually starts by taking something from the real world. You are inspired. You look at the real world, and we as the viewer are going to recognize it, or at least see the inspiration of that thing that the abstract artist looked at. So it does simplify, exaggerate, or otherwise alter the real life object. It stylizes it with a distinctive set of characteristics or parameters, either the artist or a movement or specifically, a thing, a cultural idea. But at the end of the day, it's changing the way that it looks at. So while representational is trying to make it look pretty much like the real thing, abstract is altering it and changing your perception or way of viewing it. Okay, cartoons, anime, things like that really fall under this. Homer Simpson looks like a person, but not really. He doesn't really look like a real person that I've ever met. But he does make us think of a person. Now, this is where I'll give you the fun fact. This piece here on the right, you can ask yourself real quick, what do we see? And what you should be seeing is a girl playing a mandolin or lyre of some sort. I think it's a mandolin. It's just some sort of string-based instrument. You can see that. But at the end of the day, let me ask you, does it look like a girl? Have you ever seen a person that looks like this? No, you haven't. So this is a person, even though it's altered. That's what makes it abstract. Okay. Now, this is, Girl with a Mandolin. It was painted by Pablo Picasso, and this is the part where I really like to point out that Pablo Picasso also painted this. This is the Annunciation by Pablo Picasso when he was 12 or 13 years old. Okay, I like to point that out because a lot of people don't know that Picasso could do this. He didn't just do this because he couldn't paint, this image on the right. He did this, and then he did the Annunciation, he did the representational thing, and he decided to go abstract. It was a conscious decision, which is sort of a cool thing when you learn that. Okay, now let's talk about the splatters and dots. Non-representational or non-objective art this is when you get into splatters and dots. So when people call Jackson Pollock abstract, it kind of grates me a little bit. Obviously I don't want